What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review of Temple of Elemental Evil. This game was released in 2003 by Troika, which is a studio that only released 3 games, all of which are basically cult classics, and all 3 of them require mods to run well. So with Temple of Elemental Evil, you basically have to use Circle of 8 to make the game playable, especially on modern hardware. And then there is another mod that you'll often see recommended called Temple Plus. These are designed to work together, and these mods will largely clear up most issues that you'll have with the title. But first and foremost, I want to talk a tiny bit about the history of Temple of Elemental Evil. So Temple of Elemental Evil started its life, if you will, as a module released in 1979, actually, or at least the first part of it, known as the Village of Hamlet. This was released as a little standalone module and is effectively what you'll see in the first part of the game in the Village of Hamlet. Now, the full module didn't see its release until 1985 using Advanced Dungeons & Dragons rules. This is what is properly known as the Temple of Elemental Evil. It was actually written by Gary Gygax himself, which is one of the creators of Dungeons & Dragons, and it's hard to understate the popularity of this module. You'll often hear it referred to as the grandfather of dungeon crawls. It has been known to top lists of the top modules, just period. It has seen releases in 3rd, 4th, and 5th edition, in addition to its original release. On top of that, we've even seen a module called Return to Temple of Elemental Evil, which seeks to clarify some of the points that are vague in the original module. But from there, a couple other noteworthy things about this particular game are that, again, it was released by Troika, and it was basically under constant pressure to get this title out the door, which is basically the case for Troika's entire existence. And because of that, the game released in a very buggy state. And despite that, the reviews were still generally positive, with the bugs and the lack of a cohesive story really being the big sticking points for the release reviews. But before we jump in a little farther, I do want to mention that this particular module is in the Greyhawk setting. So D&D in general, for each edition, tends to pick a default setting. For the people more familiar with 5e, that setting is the Forgotten Realms. However, there are a lot of settings, and I would say the 3 that you'll hear the most often are usually the Forgotten Realms, of course, Dragonlance, and then Greyhawk. I mention this largely because while the rules are basically the same, if you choose to play this, a lot of the gods, etc. that you'll hear referred to might not be something you're familiar with if you have only played more recent versions of D&D, which pretty much take place in the Forgotten Realms, or more specifically, usually around the Sword Coast. But with all of that said, let's actually dive in a little farther here and talk about the story of the game itself. Now, while I'm not going to go out of my way to spoil this particular story, it is nonetheless an incredibly old game and an incredibly old module that has been told time and time again, so it's kind of whatever. But nonetheless, I'm not going to go into super specific detail about it. But the basic premise is that a previously defeated evil is rising up in the temple once again. There was a battle between the forces of evil, if you will, that was ultimately defeated and kind of pushed back into the temple. Well, now that evil is ready for round 2, and over the course of the game, we uncover spies that are working for the temple, which leads us to the temple, and then the rest of the game is centered around purging the Temple of Elemental Evil, or at least in theory, purging it. We'll circle back to that. But the ultimate premise is pretty straightforward. Basically, the forces of evil are operating out of this temple, go do something about it. Now, I will say, I get where the initial reviews of this title, all the way back in 2003, said that the story was not really there. However, there is a story here. It can just be a little hard to follow. It's kind of easy to get lost in the weeds with it. And this is for a variety of factors, but I think a big part of it is how true it stayed to the module, and honestly, just how much attention you're paying at the same time. But as early as the very beginning of the game, things are going to be different for you, because depending on the alignment of the party that you chose, because in this particular edition, you can't have evil characters hanging out with good characters, etc., so all of your party members have to be within a certain alignment of each other. And this party alignment actually dictates the opening of the game. These are called the opening vignettes, and there's 6 or 7 of them. And these can show your characters doing everything from helping out a waylaid traveler to you being the bad guy and just killing peasants for fun, or even burning down a church in one case. Now, all of these vignettes will lead you to the village of Hamlet. However, the reason for you being there changes depending on the vignette itself. And then once you're in Hamlet, all of these are going to send you to the first dungeon, where you'll find the spies from the Temple of Elemental Evil. And this will give you the location of a second village. And then from that village, through a variety of means, you can learn the location of the actual temple, which sounds like a lot, but honestly, everything I just described is like maybe the first 10 or so hours of gameplay. And then the rest of the game takes place largely inside the temple, unless you're going to talk to a vendor or something in another town. But even within that framework, there's still a few things I want to talk about in terms of the story. And that is, for starters, there is a surprising amount of options here. So obviously, there's the stuff with how you start the game. But in both of the towns and even the temple itself, there are quests to be undertaken. These quests usually have a few different ways they can be approached. In fact, some of these quests are only even available to certain aligned parties, if you will. And again, this extends to the temple. The temple is a very large dungeon crawl. There are 4 factions of cultists, if you will, inhabiting the temple, and you can actually take on quests for them if you want to. Though if you're a paladin, I wouldn't recommend it. I'll double back to that. But all of this stuff leads to multiple ways to play the game as well as multiple endings. And depending on how you want to count the different endings, it's hard to say exactly how many there are. And then there's a bunch of nuance for the other areas of the game, depending on how you handled them, etc. However, I will tell you that if you want to be the bad guy, that's okay, but make sure you're not trying to do it with like a paladin or something in your party, because paladins that don't stick to their oath will become a fallen paladin, and this game will make you fall for everything. If your paladin drinks too much, they will fall. If your paladin lies about literally anything, they will fall. You can just kind of be traipsing through and not really even doing anything I would consider bad, and your paladin will just fall all the time, and it can get very annoying. But the last thing I want to say about the story and kind of playing through the game is that while there are relatively few locations, all of them are done very well as a result. The village of Hamlet actually is very well laid out, and for starters, it's very big. Like, it's not like the biggest village I've ever seen in a game or anything, but it's a very surprisingly believable village from how it's laid out to the interactions with its inhabitants and how they feel about each other. There's just a lot going on there. And then you get to the temple itself, which could have just been a straightforward kill everything dungeon crawl, and then they go and add all these quests between cultist factions. And fun fact, you can even side with the bad guys because they're offering you quests. If you want to take that a little farther, you can just join the cult, and that's a legitimate way to finish the game, which is hilarious. But from there, let's talk about some other stuff such as game systems. This particular CRPG uses the Dungeons & Dragons 3.5 rule set. There's really only one difficulty to the game. There's technically an Iron Man mode, but I would not really recommend that for this particular title. And that's largely because it can be a little unstable and the save files are known to corrupt pretty often, and if you're only dealing with one save file, that can be a problem. But beyond that, there's really just the one difficulty, and while there is a tutorial, it's kind of lackluster. And combine that with the fact that 3.5 edition D&D is incredibly rules heavy, and you got a game that can be a little tough to wrap your head around if you're not just already very familiar with the system. Now, this game and a lot of older games in general came with a huge manual, and if you buy the game, you will actually get that manual because the only place to buy this game is GOG, and they do give you a copy of the manual. So if you want to invest the time, it's definitely something you can learn, but by modern standards, you're going to have to put quite a bit of effort into it, and some of it is likely not going to be in-game effort. Now, if it just stopped right there, I've seen worse. However, you combine that with the fact that this game received very little in the way of testing. If you remember, I said they were under a bit of a time crunch to get this thing out the door, which means some of the encounters, etc., just really aren't that balanced. Some of the mechanics just straight up don't work. Some of the mods kind of address that a bit, but still. And ultimately, while I think it works well considering all of those things, I can see where someone who's not very familiar with CRPGs jumping into this could have a pretty bad experience. And while, again, there's a lot here to love, at the same time, there's a lot of things getting in the way of your ability to get there. And then the last thing I want to mention before we kind of wrap this up a bit is, as you've probably seen in the footage already, this very interesting radial menu. I'm really on the fence about this menu. Because on one hand, as someone who knows the system, I'm a pretty big fan of the menu. Like, everything I want is there. It's divided up by class and your skills and your tactical movement, etc. And if you know the system, it's pretty easy to figure out where everything is. On the negative side of that menu, though, it being this weird radial menu means that sometimes the options are just at like a 70 to 90 degree angle, which makes it kind of silly. And moreover, again, if you're not super familiar with the rule set, a lot of this stuff, you're just going to have no idea what's going on. So to kind of wrap this up and leave you guys with a formal conclusion, if you will, the game is, again, pretty faithful to the original module. There is a ton of options to play. Again, considering the time this game was released and everything else, there's just a ton of choice and consequence, and you can really choose how you want to approach this game. And I think that's great, but unfortunately, you really do need a very, very solid working knowledge of D&D 3.5 to, I would say, really enjoy yourself without a lot of undue frustration, which makes the fact that you can buy this game for $6 on GOG somehow still hard to recommend unless you're just super into CRPGs. Because while there are a lot of classics that I would absolutely point to people and be like, yeah, you should absolutely play this title, this one is a little harder to do so because, again, a lot of the rules-heavy nature of it, the fact that this is one of very, very few games that uses this rule set means that you can't even take this knowledge and then apply it to other games and enjoy them. Just makes it very hard to recommend this to anyone who isn't very dedicated to trying to play all these older CRPGs. But that said, it is nonetheless a fantastic game and is just really a piece of history. And if you got a spare $6 around and just want to give it a look on the casual side, I definitely think it is worth that, especially for how cheap it actually is. So with all of that said, guys, hope you enjoyed the review. If you did, leave a like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, thank you so much for watching. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.